hits for the bench. Extra attacker coming on to even things up. To the net, Albertson scores!
The Extra Attackers Podcast with Maude and Jordan.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Extra Attackers Podcast. Maude and Jordan here once again. Today covering a serious topic, probably the biggest story in hockey over the course of the last couple of years, which is of course the 2018 World Juniors investigation, which is now heading towards an actual court case as charges have been filed earlier this week.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a very serious situation, but it's very important to talk about. Before going into it, I just want to clarify that everything we're going to talk about here today is alleged. They have not been convicted, the players who have been charged, but there is a court case happening based on what they are alleged to have done. I do also want to thank a lot of people that helped this story come to light and as well gave great directions for telling the story. Journalists like Rick Westhead, Katie Strang, Ian Mendez did a lot of work in pushing the story up into the forefront. And I also want to thank Eric McNamara of the TSN 1200, his Offside podcast, as he broke down a lot of the legalese that goes into this sort of case. And we'll be talking about that a little bit here, about some of the more specific legal stuff. But to begin, I think what's most pertinent is just to give a quick summary of what actually happened on that night based off of what we've seen from court documents and from the stories from the aforementioned journalists. So we'll get into that right now. So this all happened back in 2018 at a World Juniors Gala where they were celebrating Canada's 2018 gold medal win. It was in London, Ontario, where one player, we don't know which one, I should actually say before that officially Dylan Dubé, Cal Foote, Alex Fermenton, Carter Hart, and Michael McLeod have all been charged with sexual assault. Those are the players. We don't know their specific roles in the story as of yet, so I'm just going to refer to them as a player at this point because we don't know who was where, who did what.
It should be noted that Dylan Dubé did pick up an extra charge, so it is possible that he is that one player.
Oh, that was actually Michael McLeod.
Oh, it was Michael McLeod. Oh my God.
All good. He's facing an additional charge to the sexual assault to being a party to the offense, which essentially means that he did something to help the criminal activity take place. So those are the players. So one of those players on that same gala night in 2018 went to a bar in London, Ontario, and met the victim, who is being known in court documents as VM, as her identity has not been revealed as of yet, and it may stay hidden throughout the course of this court trial proceedings. It wouldn't surprise me, and that's her right. So we're going to respect that. Just call her by EM. She met one of the players at a bar. And that player invited her back to the hotel after a brief interaction. EM agreed and went back to the hotel where they had consensual intercourse at the hotel. After this took place, it seemed that the player started texting other players to invite them to the room. This is all summarized and paraphrased, so it's not like exact, but it's the general vibe, just to make that clear. After that, one player came to the room. Apparently, there was no sexual interaction at this point, but then this player left to go get food for the group. After this, the four other players alleged came into the room, and this is where the alleged assault began to take place, with the group taking part in sexual activities that EM states was where she did not give consent for these activities, which was basically a group intercourse. So this continued on until the player that went to get food returned to the room with pizza and wings and was uncomfortable with what they were witnessing coming back into the room. So they allegedly left the room and weren't part of anything that happened further. I believe the assault unfortunately continued after that point. However, don't quote me on that. During the night, two videos were taking place. The first one was about 6 seconds, and it shows EM talking to the first player, I believe, and she states that everything that has occurred is consensual. And then later in the night, there's a second video that was recorded that's about 12 seconds long, and in this video, It's EM again stating that the interaction, and this was after, I believe, the group interaction took place. She states that the interaction was consensual, and she remarks that the player is so paranoid, quote unquote. After that happens, allegedly the players at the end of the night walked EM out of the hotel. They didn't force her. Allegedly, they just walked her out. When she got home later, apparently her mother found her crying in a part of the house, and she then called the London police to report the assault. At the time, the London police began investigating the incident, but as many of you know, this was eventually dropped as we don't exactly know why, because at their press conference, they were very coy about the reason why the initial investigation was dropped. You could maybe speculate that maybe it was a lack of evidence, but then again, I don't know why you'd be receiving that now. So we don't exactly know, but it was dropped at the time. Much later, I believe in 2022, we heard from Rick Westhead, I believe, that Hockey Canada had settled with EM for about $3 million in a lawsuit concerning the alleged assault. That's when all this became public. It all came to light. And because of the public response and because of the journalism of people like Rick Westhead and the other people we mentioned, you mentioned Katie Strang, the London police reopened the investigation, and Hockey Canada and the NHL began their own independent investigations. At the time, we had an idea of which players were at the gala, but there was more. There was about 8, I believe, but there was more that were even there, and we weren't exactly sure who was there, who participated. A lot of the players recused themselves. They stated that they were away from the team at that time, that they didn't actively participate because they just weren't there. That includes players like Victor Mete and Cale Makar, saying that they weren't even at the gala. There were about 8 players rumored to be directly involved in this. Only 5 are charged. We believe one of the 8 involved was the pizza person who brought the food back, noticed what was happening, and left because they were uncomfortable. There's 2 others we don't know yet their involvement, but either there wasn't enough evidence to charge them with anything, or they have an alibi for that night, being somewhere else in the hotel or not participating. So when we initially heard about this, it's been a while. It's been over a year since we initially heard about the case. It's taken a long time to get details about the specific investigation. And that is until about 2 weeks ago when we eventually heard the players were taking leaves of absences from their teams. A lot of the rumored players, all the players that were charged were granted these leaves, and they showed up sometime in this 2-week period to the London police headquarters to submit themselves for being charged. None of them were kept actually at the police station. They're probably in the area, but they're not being jailed at this time. And then this Monday, the London police held a press conference to detail kind of what's happened over the last little bit, what the charges they're pressing. There wasn't a lot they could say about what actually happened because it's still related to an ongoing court case. So they couldn't really specify details that a lot of people have been wondering about, but a lot of that will probably get revealed during the trial. It's going to take a while for the trial to actually happen. As many people know, the legal system is painfully slow. And especially in a case like this where 5 players are being charged, there's a lot of evidence to go through, and there's 5 separate lawyers going through this evidence. They will be charged together. 99% sure that they will, because being charged individually would force EM to give her testimony 5 separate times, which is beyond cruel, frankly. And as well, it would just give a lot of extra work to like the court system to process that 5 separate trials for one incident. So they'll most likely be tried together. As well, because it is an indictable offense, there are 2 types of offenses. There's a summary offense and an indictable offense. Summaries are usually lesser offenses. Indictables are more serious. Summary offenses are always tried by a judge, whereas a defense, most of the time the defense actually has, an indictable crime or conviction is more serious, and the defense has the opportunity to pick between a judge and jury, we fully expect them at this point to pick a jury, because on a jury, you only need to switch one person's mind because it has to be unanimous, instead of a judge where it's just one person. So I fully expect the defense to pick a jury for this trial, but we won't know for sure until it happens, but 99% sure. This is kind of where we sit. The players were supposed to be arraigned on Monday, which is essentially where they give their pleas of guilty or not guilty. Every single player has stated through their lawyers that they will be pleading not guilty, which makes sense because if they took a plea deal or if they just pled guilty, most likely their livelihood would be over at that point. So it's really no surprise that they're all pleading guilty no matter what happened that night. And yeah, that's kind of where we are now. And we're going to wait to see what happens as this progresses. Obviously, a very serious situation, and there's a lot to get into around it. And of course, this does speak to broader hockey culture and what it means, what it encourages, even. So that's why it's even more important to bring up. So that's kind of the summary of events that we have at this point so far.
I have to assume that in the sexual assault cases, it would be extremely rare for anyone to plead guilty anyway, just because of how difficult it actually is to get a conviction with these types of crimes. I had seen a graphic on Twitter from CBC News that was out of 460,000 sex assaults annually in Canada, for every 1,000 incidents, 33 are reported, 12 result in charges, 6 go to trial, and only 3 out of 1,000 lead to a conviction. So the fact that this has actually resulted in charges and is going to a trial, I think already is huge, because it's incredibly difficult for survivors and victims to speak up in the first place. We're glad, of course, that EM was able to do that, and it also seems like the reopening of the investigation has brought along new evidence too. So I think they must have found some pretty solid stuff to actually bring about charges in this case, eh?
Yeah. Basically, if they hadn't, they wouldn't be pressing charges. If the court is pressing charges, or what we call in Canada as the prosecutor, the Crown, since they're pressing charges, they would only ever do that if they thought a conviction was possible. If they thought it was unlikely, this wouldn't be happening. So they think that it is possible, even with a jury.
Yep, and the London police said it themselves at the press conference that new evidence was gathered after the reopening of the investigation in 2022 that they didn't have at the first time that they tried investigating. And they tried to refer to it as just one investigation, even though they were separated over a chunk of time in the middle there. So I don't know, it's tough for, like, the fact that we're going to have to wait so long for a trial is rough too. The victim has already waited so long to be able to get justice, and then not even until potentially 2026 at the earliest, I think I was hearing that the trial could be. It's going to be, the story isn't going to go away for a long time. It might go quiet for a bit, but it's going to get loud again in a couple of years.
I think so, yeah. And honestly, it's kind of unfortunate because it's all blowing up now and we won't really hear anything for a while. A lot of the details that I talked about in my summary today came from the initial court filings. I don't expect that we're going to get much else besides those for a long time. And that's, in some ways, it's a little bit unfortunate because there's a lot of speculation going on, and there's really no way to avoid that. It's going to happen in this case. But I know that early on when this was happening, EM kind of lamented that she didn't want this to be public. She didn't want this to be such a viral event. And it is super important that it is at this point. It's very impactful. But I really feel bad for the victim in this case, as it's a lot to go through, even though she hasn't publicly identified herself. It's a lot. It can't be easy.
Mm-hmm. I have to wonder as well with the gathering of new evidence, whether or not that may have to do with the cooperation of some of the players who were on that team, regardless of whether or not it was anyone who was charged or was one of the players in the room or anything like that, because obviously there were players around and in the room that were not one of the 5 players that were charged. So the London police also said that they received varying levels of cooperation from members of the World Junior team, which to me signals that certain guys were not giving them anything. But maybe there's a chance here that that some people who knew what happened are kind of feeling remorseful and are actually like helping the victim's case here with providing some information in that investigation.
That's the hope. And it's going to be interesting to see who gets called as a witness in this proceedings, because it's very possible that it could be one of the other Hockey Canada players that's not being charged directly. I know there's a lot of rumors that Drake Batherson is the food person in the story. That's unconfirmed at this point.
Yeah, that's just conjecture. It could be anyone.
Yeah, it could be anyone, but I guess that's like the prevailing rumor, I guess. And I do want to specify, I know like I talked about in the actual summary of what's happening, that there are two videos where the victim essentially says like, I'm consenting. I want to be very clear that in a Canadian court of law, consent is something that needs to be constantly reaffirmed. It can be taken away at any point, and it's not something that exists just because it was said. There's a lot of factors that go into this. Obviously, EM and the player came from a bar. Intoxication affects consent as well. And if there are notable signs of a person being inebriated, and they give consent, it's up to the other party at that time to basically say, no, this isn't happening. You're too drunk. That's the responsibility. And even if that person gives consent and the interaction happens, and afterwards they claim that or they essentially filed for sexual assault, that is a crime. That is that is a crime. As well, like it doesn't, even if a person says it, that doesn't confirm that consent is there. There were 5 other players in the room. Coercion is a big factor.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I'm glad you brought up the videos, because that's exactly the point I was going to make, is that if you're one woman in a hotel room with multiple drunk guys completely outnumbering you, even if they have video of you saying that you consent, like that doesn't seem very solid to me. That seems like I just kind of assume that in that situation it's going to be coerced. Even if that's what she said on video, I highly doubt that it was like straight up consent, or like you said, consent that remained for the duration of that night. There was also a quote from the London Police Conference from Sergeant David Unan where he said, EM believed she had no alternative but to engage in specific sex acts. Further, I believe each of the suspects knew or ought to have known EM had not consented. And he said that is when looking at a global view of the evidence. So again, even though those videos exist, it's like, I think that's very sketchy, and like even though the defense is probably going to try to prop up those videos as some sort of evidence of consent, I don't think it's going to hold up very well.
No, I think it's going to be tough, because they will definitely be brought up in one way or another. But like you said, it's very, very hard to do anything in a room with, frankly, 5 athletes, like particularly
big
trained,
guys.
To be physically capable. So just because those videos exist, it's not going to be an instant like throw out the case. It's still going to go through the whole court procedure, essentially. And like we said, consent can be removed at any time. So that's going to be another big factor in this case, because it's clear that consent was removed beforehand. And again, this is all that we have to go on at this point. All of this is alleged. And we'll find out more slowly as the court proceedings go on. But this is where we stand with the story at this point, and it's just unfortunate. It's good that we're having this discussion in hockey about things like this, because it doesn't get talked about enough, frankly. But it's really sad to see it happen anywhere. So I hope that it goes as smoothly as it can for EM. And I hope that we do get to a point where we get a pretty, how do you say, a conviction that feels earned, or on the other side of it, if they are found not guilty, if it feels based off the evidence that it is fair, because it could go either way. But this process needs to go through, and that's the most important thing, and we need to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing. Even if there may be the possibility that the these guys end up getting a not guilty verdict, we still need to go through the process, because this incident happened regardless of whether or not we know all the details in terms of consent or non-consent. It happened, and we need to go through the process and give the victim the benefit of the doubt as to what she experienced.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, with how sexual assaults usually go about in North America, it's very hard to feel confident ever trying to fight for yourself in this climate. So I like respect for her for even having her voice heard. The last detail I'll mention on the case, just for clarity's sake, the initial lawsuit that Hockey Canada settled with, that will not impact this case whatsoever. Basically, a settlement isn't a affirmation of guilt. It's essentially like they figured it out themselves. There's no real guilty party, so that can't be used. And even if it wasn't a settlement and they were forced to pay money to EM directly, the way that it is determined, blame is determined in a lawsuit versus a criminal case is very different. It's on a balance of probabilities in a civil suit. So basically, if this person was 60% responsible for what happened, they pay 60% of the proposed lawsuit amount. That's kind of how it works. Whereas in a criminal investigation, it's the jury has to decide that the conviction is true beyond a reasonable doubt. And that basically means a comfortable degree of certainty in what the prosecution is claiming. So it is very different. It won't be used in this case, the lawsuit that is. And so that's the last little bit, I guess, of specific legal stuff that's impacting what's happening here.
One other thing that I want to bring up is you see a lot of idiots like to say that, oh, women just make false accusations and stuff like that. And with how we mentioned the extremely low rate of convictions in these types of cases, I have to just point out that I think that's a very unlikely thing to happen, is that sort of false accusation. Just because what woman would go through all of this on something that isn't legitimate when there's such a low chance of it actually leading to a conviction, right? To me, it's just when we get this far to the point of charges being laid, it's pretty likely that it's justified.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And even though false convictions happen occasionally, they pale in comparison to the amount of legitimate cases that get dismissed in the courts at this point. And there is an understanding that it's very hard to prosecute a lot of sexual assault cases because a lot of the time there's very little to no evidence and it boils down to he said, she said argument. But oftentimes the courts don't put the victims in a place to represent themselves best. They're put in a lot of stressful situations. And just even how the courts are set up, EM is going to have to be in the same room as those 5 people that assaulted her. And that's not a very conducive environment to defending yourself or even feeling comfortable. So that has a big impact too. So it's important to remember that just as a fact, most of the time, women do not get their due process in these sorts of situations. And that has an impact on how you view the entire case. Like you said, there are a lot of people online that say innocent until proven guilty. And I really do respect that. I'm all for not calling these players criminals at this point, but you do have to consider the social environment that's contributing to how this case is being perceived and the people that are very upset with these players. It's understandable because it's very personal and it makes sense. As someone who is a straight white male, it won't ever impact me in the same way that it impacts those people. So it's important to give them solidarity in what's honestly a almost daily stressor for a lot of women. So that needs to be thought about if you're thinking about this case in any way. And there's a lot of people that just ignore it for a narrative that just feels right to them. And that's unfortunate. It's disheartening. And honestly, seeing so many hockey fans react that way is very disappointing. And I hope this is an opportunity for change for a lot of those people. And I hope you can just put yourself in another person's shoes and realize that this is not okay. And due process is happening, but it's still important to talk about either way.
The thing that gets me with the people who always say innocent until proven guilty is that they're not really using it in the sort of like, oh, take it with a grain of salt sense. They always seem to just be hardline in that, oh, it's innocent until proven guilty, which in their mind means that, oh, there's no way this person is guilty until like we actually see the verdict, and even then they'll probably make excuses. Like I feel like a lot of the time when it gets said, it's like very disingenuous.
That's a good point. Yeah, I would agree. It seems to be almost like the right way to phrase it, but a straw man argument in a way. Like when you assert that, we're not claiming that they're not innocent. We're taking into account everything that's happened and creating an opinion based off of the social commentary that exists around sexual assault cases. And it's not like, of course, like don't go and harass these players. That's not the point in all this. And if you do that, that's going way too far. But at the same time, to talk about it and talk about what EM has possibly gone through in a light that shows a lot of empathy and sympathy, it just makes sense, and it's the kind thing to do based on the situation at this point. And that's not calling these players inherently guilty or monsters. It's just respecting the victim based on what we know.
What did you think of Gary Bettman's comments on this whole thing before the All-Star game? He had one quote that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I don't have the exact quote on screen here, so I'll be kind of paraphrasing, but I remember reading that he said something along the lines of like, oh, like he was kind of brushing it off that, oh, it's not really a hockey culture problem, it's just like, oh, these individuals or whatever. It's like, I feel like he could have given a much better answer in terms of like, oh, we're as a league, as an organization, we're going to be doing our best to make sure that we don't have incidents like this again. Like, obviously, it's an incident that happened before these players were NHL players, but they were all drafted to NHL teams at this point, and they all continued to play in the NHL up until the point of being literally charged, other than Alex Formenton, which is a whole other issue. And I feel like Gary Bettman's PR speak was not exactly on point with that one.
It hasn't been on point lately, honestly. I understand at the All-Star game that that's not a subject you necessarily want on the forefront. It's because it's not supposed to be what the All-Star game is about. But frankly, this is like a big part of hockey right now. So it needs to be discussed. And I understand maybe not talking about it on the podium, but I remember reading that another reporter asked Sidney Crosby about this. And he basically said, hey, like we're on the All-Star floor right now. I have like a 10-second soundbite. That's not good enough. I won't talk to you here, but afterwards I'll give you like 5 to 10 minutes to talk about this. If Bettman had said something like, yeah, this stage right now, this isn't the right point to talk about it, it'll just be a flashy quote, but I'll talk to some reporters like Rick Westhead, like for about 5 to 10 minutes.
He doesn't like
afterward.
talking to Rick Westhead.
I know he doesn't. But if he had done that, it would have done a lot PR wise for me personally. And it really, like you said, it really seems like it was just brushed off because it wasn't supposed to be talked about at that point. But it's impossible to ignore, frankly.
I think how hard was it for him to just say like the charges of what had transpired are obviously abhorrent, and he disavows any of the accused actions, and that we will wait for the process to play out, and these guys are not currently NHL players as long as this trial is pending. Like, yeah. I think he just could have given an easy statement of disavowing what had happened, and he didn't really do that. It was just like, he was just kind of just like, oh, it's not a problem. It's not a hockey culture problem. It's like, oh, it's not my problem to deal with. It's like, it just felt a little flippant to me.
Yeah, no, I agree. Wasn't the best way to handle it, especially since the league is still figuring things out with this in a lot of ways. Like we've heard that the teams that have signed these players will be getting cap relief in some way, although it doesn't really matter because a lot of these players were either on 1-year deals or expiring contracts. So it won't matter too much in the end. But like the league is clearly interacting with this and they have to deal with this. It's going to be at the forefront. You have to talk about it, frankly, and be respectful about it. So
I think on the topic of the cap hits, like some people might say, you know, like, oh, the teams who employed these guys shouldn't benefit from them being away because of a crime or a criminal case. Although I do think, on the other hand, if the teams do get cap relief from the criminal players being on leave, or for like players on leave for any reason for wrongdoing or whatever, that does give the teams more incentive to actually suspend them instead of, just brushing things under the rug and stuff like that, which is I think is better. The one thing though that I think is a little bit suspect is that the players are still getting paid for the rest of the season, and like you said, they are all on 1-year contracts, so they're obviously not going to receive new contracts next year. They're probably just going to stay as like qualified RFAs with no new deals. But I do think it's a little bit stupid from the league as well that they're continuing to pay these guys in the meantime. If it does turn out that they get a non-guilty verdict and then the players can come back and say, hey, we should have had this money at this time, like, can't you just pay them after the fact if it does come to that point?
Theoretically, that could happen. The issue right now, though, and the reason, at least I believe the reason that the players are still being paid, is if they were to suspend them without pay, the NHLPA would definitely fight the league on that, because technically they haven't been, they've just been charged. They haven't actually been convicted of anything. So the NHLPA would go right back and say, no, they should be getting paid because technically they haven't done anything wrong yet. They're just being charged. That was the main reason that I heard. And since it's only the rest of the season for, I think, most, if not all of these guys, the teams are kind of the standpoint, like, there's really no point to get into that legal battle if, like, it'll probably finish by the end of the season anyway. So it won't really matter too much in the long run. And I think that's why they're still being paid at this point.
Yeah, that's probably a fair point. They just don't want to get into any like avoidable legal scuffles, I guess. It just puts a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth that the guys are still getting paid.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I understand that perspective. Kind of jumping from that point, specifically one player, Dylan Dubé, when he took his indefinite leave, the Calgary Flames seemed to frame it as a mental health leave rather than a leave for what actually was happening, which is obviously slimy if the team knew about it, and also slimy if Dylan Dubé lied to the team about it. But that was surprising to see that was the given reason at the time. So yeah, that's another thing that kind of rubbed me the wrong way.
Definitely. And I don't believe that these teams that were still employing these players, I don't believe that they didn't know, is the thing, because the Sens refused to sign Alex Formenton almost 2 years ago now, and you're telling me that these other teams had no idea this whole time? Like, I just frankly don't believe it. Maybe Dylan Dubé told the team that he was just having mental health issues or whatever, and the team didn't know about the impending charges, but I would bet money that they knew at least that he was one of the 5 rumored names.
They had to have known that. And even if they knew that and like talked to him about it and he said, no, like basically like nothing really happened, like it's all good. It does show some purposeful negligence on the team's part, just to kind of be like, well, I mean, you said that, and I mean, you're on our team and we like you because of that. So yeah, well, whatever you say.
I'm sure all the players denied involvement to their teams, but yeah. I'm also sure that the list of 5 names has been like known on the down low for a while now amongst the NHL community. Obviously, like, it was probably an open secret, I would assume. Otherwise, the Sens would have just kept Alex Formenton around, like these other teams kept these players around. But I think, not to give the Sens any brownie points or anything, because it's not about that, but I think it just makes the other teams look even worse that the Sens had let go of Formenton early, like they should have, which was the smart decision, and then these other teams just like look like complete idiots for continuing to employ these players, especially the Devils, I have to say, for re-signing Michael McLeod this season in the summer to a 1-year deal. I like to think that if they didn't know that he was one of those 5 players, I feel like they probably would have signed him to a longer term deal. I think they signed him to a short term deal just to be like, hey, we'll use him until we can't anymore. And they also brought in Cal Foote from free agency. He wasn't even a member of the organization before this season. So they re-signed 2 of these guys. They gave out new contracts to 2 of these guys in the summer, and you cannot convince me that they didn't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, especially the 1-year deal with Michael McLeod, because he's still pretty young. So I would have thought it would have been.
He's young, and
Yeah.
before the suspension, he was leading the league in face-off percentage and was having a pretty productive season. So he was an important part of their team. And only the 1 year deal, they knew. I think they knew.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's crazy too that anyone gave Calfoot another contract after because
Exactly.
technically they signed him like out of free agency.
Yep.
So they must have known that he was at least one of the 8 rumored, if not one of the 5. Like that's a big risk.
These teams know what these players had done or had been accused of doing, I should say, and they just wanted to continue using them to gain a competitive advantage until charges came. They were probably just hoping that charges would never come, right? And
Probably.
just use the players anyway. And then luckily the charges did happen.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it seems like that was kind of the mindset for most of these teams.
And Gary Bettman wants to say, "Oh, it's not a hockey culture problem." And then you have this is the way that your teams operate. Like, yikes.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And honestly, it's a sports problem in general.
Yeah,
Like,
it is.
even thinking about a player like Deshaun Watson, who's currently making millions of dollars for the Cleveland Browns after like 26 like sexual assault allegations
Oh my God.
last season. Like he was suspended by the league for like 11 games or something like that after that happened. Granted, I don't know if he's been criminally convicted of anything, but he was
26 people though? Was it like a bunch of people all coming together and making the claims at once?
Yeah, I think it was all related to like a specific massage parlor, actually.
Oh, God.
I don't remember the details exactly, but it was something like that.
If you have that many people accusing you at once, is like there's no shot that you didn't do it. Like,
Yeah.
come on.
I mean, like I don't know if he's been convicted. I don't think he's been convicted of anything, but he was suspended for 11 games and he's back. Like he played at the end of this most recent NFL season until the Cleveland Browns were not going or eliminated from the playoffs, or I don't think they made the playoffs actually, so it didn't matter. It's funny though because he's been quite bad since coming back, which kind of feels like a bit of karma.
Yeah, good.
But yeah, like instances like this show that it's overall a sports problem, and tackling it when you see it is super important because it's something that shouldn't continue.
What do you think of all of the members from the 2018 junior team being currently banned from all Hockey Canada events? The whole team.
I think it makes sense, especially since this whole situation this is a gross simplification of it, but got a lot of egg on the face of Hockey Canada. Really, they messed up like several times before this came out. And they're under new leadership because it went so poorly initially. And like the federal government questioned them on it and essentially forced them to change their leadership because they handled it so poorly. So I understand being super careful and just saying none of you are involved until we know for sure what happened. And maybe as you learn things throughout the trial, they'll start like letting some players who clearly weren't parties to this offense or even like in any capacity assisting what happened, that they'll probably let those in. But I understand the decision at this point just to be safe.
Yeah, I think it's the right thing to do for now. I hope that I'm struggling to word this properly because I don't want it to come off the wrong way, but it's pretty obvious to me that Cale Makar is going to be like an exception.
Yeah.
And I hope that it becomes like 1,000% clear before that happens, like before the 2026 Olympics, I hope it becomes like completely clear that he was not involved whatsoever. I know he was not at the Hockey Canada event. I hope that we learn that he had like zero knowledge of any of this, like, and then he's not like mentioned in the trial whatsoever, because if he is made an exception for that, which I'm sure they will do because he was not at the event, but if he did have any knowledge, then that's going to feel dirty, you know?
Yeah.
But I'm sure it's going to happen because he's definitely Canada's best defenseman and he's one of their best players overall. So they're going to make an exception for him whether they should or not. So I just hope that when it happens that he is like, clear of anything, because it's going to be a shitstorm if he's not.
Yeah, no, you're right. Granted, I feel generally pretty confident in that he isn't, because he's said on multiple occasions that he had absolutely no part in anything that happened. So he might have known about it and he might even have been interviewed about it, but it's clear that his input has to be very limited just because he wasn't even a party there. So I could understand that exception coming relatively quickly because it's hard to be involved from his standpoint. Someone like Drake Batherson, I think it's going to be a little bit more interesting. I don't know if he'll make Hockey Canada, but considering him as he was there allegedly, and he clearly didn't play enough of a role to get charged. And like we said, even though it's conjecture, the rumor is that he's the food guy in the story. I do wonder how they're going to handle that prospectively, especially in Hockey Canada competitions where not like the best NHLers go. That that seems to be like an area where he might participate, where they might have to make that decision. So it's going to be interesting with those players who are not being directly charged, but were allegedly at the hotel, what Hockey Canada does with them. Because yeah, I would be very careful about it if I was them.
That's the thing. Guys like Batterson, Kyrou, and Thomas are not necessarily on the Olympic team radar, but they're definitely the exact type of players, especially with Ottawa and St. Louis being completely mid teams. They are the exact type of players that will get called to the World Championships that happen during the NHL playoffs because their teams are not going to make the playoffs, or they'll just like get wrecked in the first round if they do make it in. Those are the type of players that you see at that tournament all the time. So I think, with even though those players were not any of the five named, they were on that team, and it's going to be interesting to see how Hockey Canada holds up this ban, how long they hold it up, because like I said, these are the type of guys that will be like first line on that type of team.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It'll be interesting to see how it's handled. I guess finishing up, the next steps in this after the arraignment, the lawyers in the case have been sent all the evidence that the prosecutors have collected. So the defense is going to go over all the evidence they have to prepare their defense, essentially. Since five different players are involved, five different lawyers, this could take a long time. That's why a lot of lawyers are thinking that this case might not go to trial until even 2026. Some people are thinking it might be closer to 2025, but it's going to be a while till we hear anything else. So that's kind of where we're at now. But me and Maude thought it was very important to talk about and separate out individually because it's such an important story, and it's hard to give it the respect it deserves by lumping in other topics, and even it kind of diminishes it in a way that it doesn't deserve to be. So that's why we're talking about it here and outlining it, at least from everything we know so far.
Yeah, it felt bad, like, potentially skipping over it, and it also felt bad if we had shoved it into another episode, especially the previous episode that had a lot of, like, catching up on more general NHL news, that, like, the London Police Conference happened within that time frame, right before we were, or right after. It was planned, it was scheduled to happen right after that last episode. So if we had lumped it all into one, it would have felt stupid. It would have felt dirty. So we had to touch on this. It's more important than any hockey news. It's a culture issue with men in our world, and it needs to be discussed.
Agreed. And one last big thank you to, of course, Rick Westhead, Katie Strang, and Ian Mendez for all the reporting they've done on this so far. I believe they were all in London actually for the police hearing, so they've been following it around and putting in the work. And this is why journalism is important in a lot of ways. There's a lot of schlock journalism that people jump on very quickly, which is fair. And times things like disinformation or misinformation deserves to be criticized. But in cases like this, it really shows why journalism is so important. In the world, in society. So really appreciate if anyone listening here gives those reporters a listen or read a bit of their stuff, because they deserve it.
100%. I think that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you everyone for watching or listening. Have a good one.
Take care.